Hello everyone, my name is Reese Lindmark and you are listening to The Reese Show. On the show, we're trying to clarify what a good future looks like. I know we're all a bit sad about late-stage capitalism, and we want to transition to something, but we don't really know what's next. So, on the show, we interview experts about what is emerging, this beautiful future vision that we can all lean into. I hope it gives you a sense of purpose and clarity about the future. If you like the show, feel free to do something about it. You can leave us a 5-star review. You can tell your friends. You can name your first child Reese. Whatever makes you happy. And if you really dig it, we have an online school called Root, where we help folks understand these root level systems to find our route forward. We have cohorts of world-class systems thinkers that run every couple of months. So if you're interested in that, check us out at root.co. That's ROOTE.co. Thanks. Hello, listeners. Today I'm excited to chat with Isabella Garcia-Camargo. Isabella works at Stanford's Internet Observatory as a research analyst and is the project manager for two amazing projects that I love, the Election Integrity Partnership and the Virality Project. Isabella, thanks for being on the show and welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, excited to dive in and chat. Yeah, it's been cool for me to kind of see, as the election and various misinformation, disinformation things were happening, to see EIP, this Election Integrity Partnership, pop up was really cool. And just to see you kind of coordinating all the cats there was really interesting. So I think maybe let's start with could you tell us and the listeners a little bit more on what the EIP was and what your role within it was?
Totally. So I think the biggest thing about the EIP and cornerstone to how we're thinking about the model and improvements and what it meant is it was very serendipitous. It kind of came up out of nowhere. There was a group of 5 Stanford students who went to work at CISA, which is a cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency. And that's the agency that really runs the US elections. So I was one of those students. I had gone, between my undergrad and master's program just for an internship, thinking about democracy. Generally, I like elections. So showed up there and was really ready to do whatever. Initially was working on some security products and then kind of talking to election officials, started thinking about, okay, I've been working on disinformation throughout my college time. I really like the problem. What are the election officials thinking about as they go into the 2020 election? And how do they think that they're actually going to deal with this? Because, I've heard about all the disinformation in the 2016 election. People were talking about it for 2020. But really kind of the bottom line was, after a couple of weeks of discussing with the election officials, I realized that there wasn't a huge plan per se, right? Especially in comparison to what I knew we were capable of, right? Being at the Observatory, I had worked on a lot of takedowns. I knew the tooling that was out there, but this tooling wasn't in the hands of the election officials. And frankly, they just didn't have the time to think about this. Running an election is extremely difficult. There's 1,001 things that you have to be thinking about all the time, and extremely resource strapped as well. So kind of the idea came up of, what if we had a war room, which would be monitoring for disinformation in real time, and then providing these insights to election officials so that they don't just know when a machine breaks down, they know when people are talking about a machine breaking down, for example, or when people are talking about this specific polling station not allowing XYZ voters to come in and vote, right? And it seemed like a pretty core part of this whole mission of protecting 2020 and protecting the legitimacy of the election. So that's kind of the origin story there. And then the long story short is I brought it up to the people who I work with, both at CISA as well as the Observatory, spun up the EIP about 100 days out from the election. And really, I think to the credit of the leads of the organizations that joined the partnership, I think the most incredible thing was how we were able to make it happen in that time period, and how much people put aside their incentives that they had in their research, in their company, in their think tank organization to come together for this goal of let's help these election officials, let's help this organization that runs our elections think about this massive problem that's coming up against us.
Yeah, that's cool. I think it, like many things, good things in the world, it's just like an organic thing, or it's like, oh, y'all aren't thinking about this too much, but it's possible to do a ton of effort here and to kind of pre-bunk the whole, and to get ready for the whole issue that's starting to emerge. And for me, I just found myself as election times were spinning up, I was like checking in with EIP and being like, okay, what are the current narratives? Okay, stop the steal, blah, blah, blah. And so it's kind of good for me to check in with y'all, but like, did it actually, I guess, and how did you all like determine impact? It's like, were you able to help the elected officials like pre-bunk things, or like, would there have been X more people died in the, insurrection or whatever than would have died? Like, how do you think about impact?
Totally. And this is probably one of the most frustrating things about working in the disinformation space. I come from a computer science background and was on my way to do more PM type work in industry before this info bug got to me. But so for me, metrics and determining impact is something that's extremely important. And it is how I work. It's how I determine what I'm doing day to day. And in the disinformation field, this is basically impossible, right? Like there's been research papers and whole doctorates given out of people still trying to understand the impact of disinformation in the 2016 election, right? Not to mention, how are we determining impact in real time as we're trying to find narratives in real time? So this was extremely frustrating while we were running the EIP. Probably the researchers weren't thinking about this every day, but something I thought about every single day. It's like, is what we're doing important? Does it matter? What's the bottom line here? And I remember talking to Alex Thomas about this, who was the lead for the Stanford side. And I just kind of said, hey, I'm super worried. We're writing all these tweets. We're putting out these blog posts. There's 100 people working together towards this effort. But I feel like people still believe that the election is being stolen, right?
Mm-hmm. Like I read it, like Reese Lindmark, random like Twitter person who's super into this crap is into it, but like, is it reaching the folks it needs to reach or whatever?
Totally. And also because, we're putting it out on Twitter, like who could possibly be listening on our Twitter page, right? Is someone who genuinely is going to believe that their vote was stolen going to go follow the EIP Twitter? Like, I didn't think so, right? And I think Alex brought up a couple points which were really, really key here. One of them was, the work that the EIP did was not to go try to get to the deepest rungs of QAnon followers, right? And try to pull them out, right? That's a completely different effort, a completely different ballgame, right? I started thinking about the EIP more as an offensive tactic, right? Disinformation, it moves very quickly. And oftentimes the institutions that we have are reactive towards disinformation. Really what we're trying to do with the EIP is start to get that asymmetrical playing field a bit more level, right? So just bringing the tools to people who could potentially actually reach those voters and are in the position to actually put those counter narratives out. Just give them the information, get them that narrative, not, 10 minutes after it starts, but at least within the week, within the day, not 2 months later, right? And so, yes, like we put out a lot of blog posts, we put out our Twitter, all of that was really, really important. But our relationships with the key stakeholders, especially with the election officials and key civil society groups who have the trust in the communities already, I think that was the most valuable part of the EIP. And obviously, you put something out on Twitter, the followers that we have were able to communicate this to their families. That interpersonal connection is also very important. But the Twitter and the likes weren't everything. It was really about the coalition, the partners, the stakeholder relationships that we were able to manage throughout the election.
Yeah, that's interesting. What was it like? I'm just purely curious, personally curious. You probably, because as 2020 started to happen, it was like, okay, this could be a little bit of a sketchy election. Like 2016 has some issues. Okay, 2020, oh, not too much Russia yet. Okay, that's pretty good. But like, oh God, like Trump's being a little crazy here. Like, oh boy, like stop the steals, like becoming a thing. Like, oh boy, now there's like riots at the Capitol. So like, what was it like for you to be, you were like, was it a bunch of late nights, like you being on the call there?
Oh gosh. Yeah, no, it was, the period between August and November, right, until after the election was called, that was just one of the craziest periods of kind of my overall work life thus far. It was all the time. It was constant. Like you couldn't think about anything else because you just were seeing the slow burn. It felt like an avalanche in slow motion of, in August, we could have told you that January 6th was going to happen, right? In August, right? And it was just seeing the accumulation of evidence and seeing how these masses of online users were, it was organic. It was like people were finding the evidence themselves, like framing it and networking with each other to understand and build up these conspiracies. And it felt pretty helpless at a lot of points. It was just kind of like, what am I gonna say to these people, right? There's a scaffolding. The scaffolding was a big problem there, where no matter what, the underlying assumption was we're looking for evidence of fraud. And we're looking to show how this is going to be a stolen election, right? So yeah, I mean, the way that we worked at the EIP is that we had 12-hour shifts where people would be online all day. So almost like business hours for disinformation monitoring. And so there was on-call managers, right? I was one of the on-call managers. There were tiers of different analysts and really just trying to operationalize to keep up with this huge flow of disinformation that was coming through. And so we started that in August, ran it through till the election was called. So yes, a lot of hours looking at disinformation, a lot of hours just thinking about, we're overwhelmed with the sources we already have, but where else do we need to be looking? How do we preempt this? How do we make our turnaround a little bit faster? Yeah, an incredible experience, but I would characterize it as a slow burn, which was extremely frustrating at times.
Yeah. Was it well, there's something interesting about as you start to be aware of what the information ecosystem is doing and what kinds of the main memes or whatever, the main ideas that are forming from it, as you said, you were able to see in August that there was, and everybody was kind of able to see this, okay, fraud is this underlying meta narrative, that is just going to come up, and it's just coming up in all these different ways. And so you can see it, you could predict or whatever, maybe not all the way to January 6th, but you could see that that was going to happen. Is there, and I guess my question is, actually, let's take a step back here for a second. How do you think, and you kind of chat about doing the counter narrative work and doing the kind of proactive work and the pre-bunk work or whatever, how do you view these information ecosystems more generally? If you compare and the ways to make them more fair or more good or less misinformation, how do you kind of view the system as a whole?
Yeah,
it's a tough question. It's a tough question. Yeah.
How do you view the information system as a whole? I mean, I can break it down maybe a little bit. I'll start with that infrastructure point, right? I think, and again, from my sense of 2016, I was barely starting kind of my career in 2016. But my sense of that was, it was a lot more focused on this foreign interference piece, right? And we didn't see what we saw in 2020, which was 2020, there was a whole machine at work. It was kind of the evolution of basically a small child in 2016 coming into maturity in 2020, where there was, it's just like a well-oiled machine that could take a small narrative, take an idea that a Sharpie could potentially bleed through a piece of paper and produce out of that a claim that people would be chanting outside a polling station. That production line that was new, and that was shocking to see happen during the election. How large-scale influencers were listening to what the masses were saying, what they were concerned about, how they were feeling, pull up those ideas, and then echo them back down. I think Kate Starbird at the University of Washington has really driven this point home and has a lot of really good images on Twitter that she's been sharing about that dynamic. But we call it the participatory nature of this disinformation. It's not just that Trump was tweeting that the election was going to be stolen. And it's not just that one person in Maricopa County thought that the Sharpie was going to bleed through the piece of paper. The story I'm referring to is Sharpiegate, for anyone that doesn't know it. Sharpiegate. Yes, Sharpiegate, which was the theory that specifically Republican voters at polling stations were being given Sharpies, which would disenfranchise them because the voting machines would not count their votes. So, but to the point was, it's not just someone at the top shouting things down to the users at the bottom, and it's not just users talking among themselves. it's the synthesis of these two, and it's the masses and the populations looking for evidence and creating these stories among themselves. Some mid-scale influencers pushing them up to the top, and then large-scale verified influencers taking these narratives and then echoing them down to the bottom, right? And this like vicious cycle that was going on over and over again, and just churning out these narratives. So that was, I think, one of the most surprising facets of the information space that certainly was created far before the 2020 election, but was activated in this incredible way during the election. And something that is it's like a wound, or what is it? It's not a bug, it's a feature or something of the information ecosystem that we're in, because it's rooted into the network, right? One thing that I think
let me pause you for a second there. Yeah, I think it's interesting to hear. Yeah, I think the 2016 version, as you said, that was a version where you were kind of like still in college or whatever at the time, but so you weren't like deep into your work that you're doing now. But I think that there's a 2016, and I wasn't also personally, I was doing music education at the time, so like wasn't really that into it either. But yeah, it sounds like, as far as both you and I understand, it's like it was nation state stuff. You know, it's kind of like old school. You know, it's like, you know, top down, you know, centralized. You know, like Russia's like, oh, let's like get into the U.S. information ecosystem through these new social media things. Like that was one of the main stories, and was powerful in a variety of ways. And this one, as you said, it's kind of like, yeah, it's kind of more native. It's a little bit more, there's this machine. And the interesting thing about, I like you calling it a well-oiled machine, because it's like these networks, it's kind of like, it's taken a good amount of time for these networks to come into existence. And now you can imagine them as these like kind of like network beings that have trust between them and have like lower transaction costs between them. And that allows them to have this well-oiled machine, as you said, that like moves things from top to middle to bottom, you know, through these, you know, cycles, and can just take anything. It has lots and lots of small experiments to run at the bottom level. Oh, and then one of them, Sharpie Gate, is powerful, and then it gets the hashtag Sharpie Gate, and then it just propagates into the system ridiculously quickly, because the system's kind of optimized to take things at the bottom and push the most powerful narratives through the system.
That last sentence you just said, that's virality, right? Like that's the point of a lot of these social media algorithms. And honestly, less on Twitter, but think about a social media platform like TikTok, for example, right? Where it's not that you go around and follow verified people all the time. It's a lot of the times you're seeing some random person with 10 followers who bubbles up on your feed, right? And it's pushing information at you, right? So I think it's important to note that a lot of these, like the fact that this machine exists, it does have to do with how the product, right, is built. And the veneer of authority that is created within this ecosystem, right? It's not broken English coming out of some Russian bot, right? It is a verified influencer with over 1 million followers who's appearing also on cable news, right? It's not just Twitter, right? It's their presence across all these different social media platforms, on cable news, sometimes elected officials, right? So it's not just like, first of all, right, I just said it's part of the product, right? But it's even beyond the product. It's people who in our society have a lot of trust, right? And have engendered this trust and authority. And are now just part of they found their slot within the machine, right? So I think that's the problem that I'm most concerned about. Not because of, you know, it's largely because of the continued existence, right? It's not something that I see a clear through line for how we can solve, right? Because people are free to choose who they put their trust into, right? And that ecosystem has proven to be very, very effective at spreading pretty malicious claims.
Yeah, and do you think, you know, thinking about the kind of solving stuff side, do you think if we have these kind of well-oiled machines that are really good at, you know, rising up viral content and then spreading it within the system, no matter it's like healthiness for everybody or truth or whatever, how do you, like, you know, I'm tempted by the like, oh, let's like add friction back into the system, or like, let's, you know, do some like mediating consent stuff or whatever. Like, how do you think about the ways to kind of positively shape these, you know, viral beings, these like weird information ecosystems?
Right. So yeah, I think there's two things here, right? One, along the lines of what you just pointed out, friction, right? Recognizing that the fact that these organizations, institutions, machines, I've said a lot of words at this point, like the fact that this entity exists, right, is due to some of the platform affordances, right? That being the algorithm works in their favor, right? Because they are these large celebrities. In our work, we called them repeat spreaders, right? Because no matter what they said, they could get something trending on Twitter within 30, 40 minutes, right? A narrative that started within this system. So understanding, okay, what are the platform affordances that continue to allow this system to perpetuate narratives? And is there some friction that we can add in? Or how do we think about kind of on platform what that looks like? I think there's also a lot of work to be done on the offensive side here, right? So how do we think about the problem that we're facing is networked. The problem that we're facing is it is vicious. It moves very quickly. It's always been the case that disinformation is created far more quickly than at the rate at which we can fact check all this disinformation, right? So we need to be thinking about this problem as, offensively, what are the tools that we can give the trusted versions of this information in order to start offensively working against the bubbling up of these narratives, right? In the 2020 election, the most pervasive or the most promising tool was a rumor control page, right? Which I think we've chatted about a lot since the election, and which we are now promoting for vaccine misinformation response. But the problem of disinformation is a networked problem. It is organized. It moves very quickly, and you have to have a networked, quick responding solution to start to try to even that playing field.
Yeah, interesting. And so like that rumor control page, this is, I'm just looking at it now, it's part of the CISA work, which is, and if I understand, CISA for listeners is like, it's like a part of government that works on election integrity and misinformation. Is that roughly correct?
So sorry. Yeah, I mean, kind of, right? So CISA, it is part of the DHS. So it's an agency under the DHS that is in charge of all of our critical infrastructure. So that's everything from, highways, electric grids, and elections happen to be, critical infrastructure. So since 2017, they've had the mandate to, okay, elections, you're there to protect it. They had focused a lot and improved a lot on the hard cyber part there. So they secure all of our voting machines and, how the election is actually run. But to their mandate, they have also added in the Protect 2020 mission, specific focus on the integrity of the election itself. So that was added actually. And I think that's a really interesting add. But anyways, yeah, just to clarify that CISA does a lot more than just elections, but has had a lot of scrutiny over the past couple of months, obviously because of the election work.
Got it. Yeah. And so I'm looking at the rumor control page and, I'm looking at one of these rumors that says votes are being cast on behalf of dead people and these votes are being counted. And the reality is that, well, it's not really true, and so I see some of the power on this page is just like you could look at it and you could see, oh, okay, here's some negative rumors, here's the reality, and maybe like here's a way to, but I'm thinking about like stop the steal, like the hashtag stop the steal. I'm not sure if that is like, if that is helped or stopped or hampered at all by this rumor control page,
Totally. Absolutely. And I think that's a really core point here, right? So like you can start to think about these things as there's levels, right? Nobody is born out of the womb believing stop the steal, right? Stop the steal is a scaffolding. It is the overall kind of belief that the election itself is going to be not legitimate, right? So for these scaffolding problems, there are solutions specific to those scaffolding problems. That is the most difficult problem, right? Like you're talking about people do not believe in the authority of elected officials, right? And the institution of government itself, right? So you're not going to solve that by having a rumor control page, right? But there are ways that people get pulled into that underlying belief of the scaffolding, right? So you could have gone to vote in Arizona, right? And you could have received a Sharpie and you could have thought everything was okay, right? You go online and then you understand a little bit more about the Sharpie Gate narrative and you talk to your friends, maybe some friends who already, completely have lost all faith in that kind of centralized authority and they pull you into the scaffolding, right? So a rumor control page is helpful for, I think, those narratives that bubble up and can pull that questioning population into that underlying, everything is a lie. I am skeptical of anything that's coming out of these institutions. The election officials are corrupt. The whole system is broken, et cetera, right? So I guess what I'm trying to get at is there's a spectrum here, and you can't solve all of it by rumor control. But you have to basically, you start this, you have to moderate the problem a little bit, right? So there's people who are already radicalized. There's people who completely have faith in every elected official. And on that spectrum, right, targeting the questioning population is a good place to start. But those solutions are very different than people who would look at the rumor control page and say, this is a bunch of BS.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I think it's interesting to hear you use the term scaffolding a good amount. And it sounds to me, it's like scaffolding, it's the list. I would call it or the book that I'm writing right now is all about like memes. And so I would call it like a memeplex. It's like it's a lots of different kind of both things that could either be scaffolding you up or like pulling you down, depending on whether you want to go up or down. And it is a reinforcing set of ideas that keep on pulling you deeper into it. Or like, how do you think about scaffold? Like how do these scaffolds work? How do they work?
Right. When I say the word scaffolding, I think what I'm trying to get at is it's like a framework, right? It's the lens through which you view new information that's coming to you, right? And we all have these frameworks, right? It's not that just half the population or a tenth of the population has one framework, right? And everyone else is in agreement, right? No, everyone has a framework through which they understand facts, through which they understand. It's like your bias, right? Whether or not you'll believe in A or B or C, right? So, but when I'm talking about, so that's what I mean by scaffolding, right? But then some of these frameworks, right, get to the core of some really key institutions, such as whether you or not you believe that government is a functioning part of society and that it can run an election in which your vote will count, right? So that's a specific scaffolding that was primed. It's like a specific framework coming into the election where more and more people were drawn into this idea that everything is broken, the entire system is rigged, and no matter what happens on November 3rd, it will have been cheated, right? So when you have that specific of a framework that's surrounding one event in which there's this just network of people pulling you in and bringing you more evidence, it's like, oh, you see this specific barcode on the outside of your ballot. You should interpret that in this way, right? Then it also stops people from looking for more evidence, right? It's kind of like a crutch, right? You don't have to look for more evidence because you have this framework through which you understand the world. When it could be that barcode is just, part of how the mail-in ballot works and how your vote would be counted, right? But it allows you to just take shortcuts and align things into your view of the world much more quickly. Again, we all have these frameworks, we all have these lenses, but it was really, really interesting to see a really specific one created around the election, and which tied in so closely with online narratives and how that framework was created and reinforced in online spaces.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, that is. Yeah, that narrative of, hey, you can't really trust the government to do anything. And so then anything that you see from the government is like, oh, God, I'm not trusting them to do this random barcode or whatever. Like, oh, here's a kitten. Well, that kitten means that the government is, Epstein did it. Or, and so it's interesting. I think that there's, and it makes me just think of like a crucial meta thing that all people need to have is a desire to have a scout mindset instead of a soldier mindset, and to actively be trying to understand their biases or, actively looking for more evidence or whatever. And I just think that that's a difficult thing with our reality now, is that a lot of folks have this thing that says, oh, I'll just take it what it is as true, instead of like actively trying to change their own beliefs or whatever. Do you think, one final note on that is like, there's I feel like, in something when I had Renee on the podcast, a year or two ago, it was like, I was trying to, I think both you and her talk a lot, and generally the information ecosystem folks talk a lot about like how platforms work and what the friction of platforms is and how to, counter disinformation, misinformation. But there's also this other perspective, like media literacy or whatever, which is like, instead of focusing on the information, you kind of focus on, in the platforms, you focus on the people. And what do you think about that? Like, what do you think about like how much impact we can have by kind of quote unquote upgrading the people themselves instead of trying to change the platforms?
Totally. I mean, that's a very packed question there. So let me try to break it down. I mean, to your first point of what you were saying of, having people with a scout mindset, super, super interesting. I would agree. Every single time I'm going to news sources or trying to understand a new international problem, et cetera, I really try to bring myself out of that framework of, okay, I need to read XYZ sources, think about the problem this way. If I was trying to prove myself wrong, what would I say, et cetera? Sure, that's great. The funny thing about this scout mindset, though, and telling people, you should question everything that you see, that's exactly the conspiratorial way of thinking about things, right? It's question everything, right? Nothing that you see is authoritative, right? So this is a really, really difficult problem, right? Because that framing is actually where a lot of these more conspiratorial communities already live. So it's a difficult problem of what are the upgraded authorities in kind of this new information ecosystem, right? I think the Martin Gurri's Revolt of the Public book was the first time I really started thinking about this in this way. And I think one of his main points in the book is the old authorities, they're not coming back, right? And now we have this public that is, moving very quickly, coming to conclusions very quickly, nihilistic about everything, breaking everything down, questioning everything, right? So in this new landscape, how do you think about authoritative information and what does that look like, right? And it's not going to look like, we're not going back, right? We're not going back to nightly news. One person tells you, this is how you think about this international problem. Sounds good, right? So we have to be really creative there in terms of, okay, so then what we're doing right now is not working out super well, right? And it's not a great, I don't feel great about the idea that like demigod celebrities who are verified on Twitter are our new authorities, right? Yeah. So what's a more creative solution here? And I think the second part of your question was upgrading the people. That I totally agree, right? And media literacy is very, very core to this solution. But we got to think about like, what are the priors that we're coming into with now, right? So we can't just X out the population that currently exists, right? And there's a new population of people. We can integrate it into public school education and think about, how do we teach people how the FDA works, right? People don't need to know how vaccines work to trust the vaccine, right? A lot of these conspiracy theories are about, oh, Fauci just woke up one day and allowed me to inject myself with Pfizer. No, if you understood how the vaccine development and approval process works, a lot of these conspiracies lose their legs, right? So how institutions work and teaching people, how does an election get run? How do these rules come up? How can I change these rules by engaging in civic processes? That is very, very, like that is extremely important. Like understanding how the institutions that govern our lives work is something that nobody teaches and would solve a lot of these problems. But that has to be done in concert with, okay, there's people who are already very, very far gone. What are we going to do about that as well?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of like it's a classic, where it's like, how do we help the folks today, and also how can we make sure that everybody's upgraded for tomorrow? And I like what you said about the demigod celebrities. That's a hilarious way to call it. It's like, okay, whatever Elon Musk says, like that's what I'm going to do. And I think that I think hopefully the new influencers are kind of a networked influencer, which is where you just like look at a ecosystem of people in the climate tech space or in the epidemiology space, and you kind of have a feed that incorporates a lot of their thoughts together, and then that thing, that like network of ideas, is kind of the influencer. Or in any case, I have a question for you about let's transition to the Virality Project, which is the other big thing, and you were just starting to talk about some vaccine stuff and Dr. Fauci. Tell us a little bit more about the Virality Project and what you all are trying to do with vaccines and misinformation.
Totally. So the Virality Project is essentially, we finished the election integrity partnership. We had a report to write. We realized that another huge disinformation crisis was on its way and got the gang together again and set up a new partnership. It's essentially how that came about. So a lot of the people who worked on the EIP are now working on the Virality Project. And we're just trying to bring what we learned from the election work and bring it to the space. It's everything from how does the team work together, right? We have academics working with for-profit companies, working with think tanks, right? Like what are the different incentives and how do you align everyone into this like long-term marathon of a research project, right? Because at least with the election, we had an end date, right? But the vaccine, we have no idea when we're going to be done. We've been going since January and it's May right now. And we'll be going through at least August, right? So it's understanding, okay, especially with this model of, I think we call it internally a center of excellence model, right? A clearinghouse for disinformation. It shouldn't live in an academic project for forever, right? I spend a lot of time thinking about, oh my God, we're going to run out of budget. Oh my gosh, XYZ. Ideally, this work of real-time analysis of disinformation and working with the social media platforms, the civil society people, the government people, the academics, that whole framework, ideally we'll be able to put in a more long-standing space eventually. But this is just our V2, and we're trying to understand, okay, what didn't go well in the EIP? How do we make it better? Who else do we involve? What other partners do we need? And all the time, making sure that we're doing the research, right? And gathering the facts on, okay, what do people believe about the vaccine? What are the communities that are most engaged? Are the tactics the same? Are we seeing new tactics to spread vaccine disinformation versus election disinformation? So it's been very exciting, really great team. A smaller effort for the EIP, we had 120 people at the peak. And for the Virality Project, we've kept it slimmer because it's a longer project. So it's about 40 people, 40 to 50. And yeah, we're just trying to keep learning. We're trying to advance this model and understand, how can we make impact right now, and also think through this model for the future.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would differentiate those two as like that model. You could call it the Center for Excellence model. You could call it a network of networks model or whatever. Is a kind of a new institutional form. Or, it's the partnership and the project, or the kind of this happened at the beginning of the pandemic a lot, where folks were creating. There's like the hashtag masks for all, and the it was groups that were aligned around a shared goal, and are kind of coming from a bunch of different spots. And so it's like, what can this new kind of institution look like, and how to run those kinds of institutions. So it's cool that you all are thinking about that. On the other side of the object level, on the ground, what kinds of patterns are you seeing in the Virality Project? What are they similar to an election or not?
Yeah, I think this is one of my favorite parts of my job, is just getting to think about how do you track disinformation in the most efficient way, right? It's different from long-term academic research. It's also different from if you were in an industry, right, and trying to get a product out really, really quickly. So it's kind of in between the two, and it's so one specific example I can give is in the EIP we had one of the problems we had is it's kind of a whack-a-mole problem. Every day you can see a new post about someone who is dead who supposedly voted, right? And so we spent a lot of human power kind of analyzing all of these things, putting a case study together, sending it to the platforms, right? One of the big upgrades I wanted to figure out for the Virality Project is, how do you track narratives, not just incidents, right? How do you track the formation of these large-scale ideas, which we talked a lot about at the beginning of the podcast. And so how do we operationalize that collective sense-making process, right? And so to that end, we developed some tech tooling for it. We modified our workspace management system to be tracking narratives, not just incidents. We had to retrain the analysts. So it's really interesting work, because you have to understand a lot about how disinformation works. You have to understand a lot about people. You have to understand a lot about people and how they understand the ideas themselves. And the tech behind it is really, really cool, right? It's how do you understand when one posts about a pregnant woman getting the vaccine and having a side effect, right? 1 week, that's a really interesting finding because it's signaling the surge of that narrative across different online communities. Another week, it's just another post, right? So all of this context is important, especially for our stakeholders, to telling them, what's important. What do you need to counter right now? And that's a hard decision to make, right? Because you don't want to spread misinformation by going out and debunking something that's not that important. So the stakes are high. The problem's really interesting, but it's really great to work with people in this space because I found that everyone's super interested in the problem. It's a very novel, kind of new, growing area. So really anyone can get into it right now because it's not like there's a whole lot of people that are gatekeeping it right now. So
yeah. So whoever you are, get out there and start researching misinformation, disinformation.
Everyone.
Is it what tech? Yeah, exactly. What tech platforms? Like, I know you all work with Replica, or like, how do you, like, if I wanted to do this and I want to like track the ongoing narratives within the like anti-vax or whatever world, how do you all do it?
Totally. I mean, so we use a lot of open source investigation. We do have some custom tools or API access just as, being an academic institution. So we use a lot of CrowdTangle, which is a platform that you can monitor Facebook with, and Instagram and Reddit. We have Twitter Enterprise API, just so we can get a whole lot of Twitter data. But there's, non-private versions of all of these tools, right? There's Twerk, which you can use to get the last 7 days of Twitter data, which is really the only thing that's important in many of these cases. Bellingcat has a really good OSINT handbook where you can use a lot of the tools that we use. So I would say, it's maybe 60-40 open source tools versus specific licenses that we have. But I would recommend everyone gets a CrowdTangle plugin at least. That's something you can get on your Chrome. And it allows you to see any link that you have. You can understand what engagement it's gotten across Facebook over the past forever, right? And that's really, really interesting information. You can see, oh, wow, this link that I'm on, actually a whole bunch of anti-vaccine pages shared it yesterday, right? So maybe I should think about when I'm reading this, like who's been promoting it. Anyways, there's a lot of things out there.
Yeah, no, I love it. That was essentially what I was looking for, is like CrowdTangle. I don't have CrowdTangle on my Google Chrome right now, but I will after this call. So thank you for that. I want to get into kind of wrap mode here and ask a couple final questions, mostly, or first some like overrated, underrated questions, which are, I'll just say a thing and then you can say whether you think it's overrated or underrated. The first is how hard it is to moderate video. Is that overrated or under? Because it's like a big theme for listeners, is that, I was like, oh man, like TikTok and YouTube, it's hard to moderate them because it's not text. Is it overrated or underrated how like hard it is?
Gosh, well, I don't feel super qualified to give this rating because I don't have the tool set and thousands of engineers that these platforms have. It is underrated how poorly they are moderated. The amount of work that the platforms claim it would take, I feel like is overrated, but surely it must be a very difficult problem if they haven't figured it out yet. I mean, especially live streams. We talked a lot about live streams in the election. That was a huge problem. So I guess mixed bag here.
So it sounds like the amount of impact that it has is like underrated
for sure.
But the amount that the platform's like, oh, but it's so hard to, is overrated. They're overrating how much effort it would take.
They have transcripts of all of the of the audio. At least that. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, surely it just seems like something could be done a bit more.
Yeah, got it. The other one is like a kind of what I would call like an elephant in the room of this. I mean, this isn't totally true, but is moderately true, is, the left versus right side of this, where it's like a good amount of the misinformation, disinformation is like coming through the right, and there's like, and at the same time, there's various things on the left. I was just reading a nice article in the Atlantic today about how all the folks on the left are like not following the science and like, making sure that kids can't be in schools or whatever. But how do you think about, I guess, is the amount that the misinformation flows through, the amount that, let me phrase the question, the amount that flows through primarily right-leaning ecosystems, is that overrated or underrated?
Okay. In the election, not overrated. In the election, we did see, and like you can go check our report of how we conducted the methodology, but the vast majority of the election fraud narratives were right-leaning and spread in right-leaning communities. However, one thing I'll say here that to caveat that is this idea of scaffolding, right? And this idea of how much are you believing random Instagram stories to get your factual evidence of what's happening in the world. And I think that's vastly underrated, how especially people in my generation, right? Like the Gen Zers, and I'm culpable of this as well, right? Of how much we are apt to believe some random person on Instagram posting a story about XYZ issue and how I can explain it in 10 Instagram slides. You cannot explain fundamental issues in 10 Instagram slides, right? And priming the people kind of in this kind of new generation of very online people, students, et cetera, like priming ourselves to be so quick to jump to conclusions it does not bode well for this whole, the right will always be a disinformation machine and the left will never get there, right? So I think that I would caveat that with that observation.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as a final question here, for you as a Gen Zer, and for me, I'm 29, so I'm like just at the millennial thing. What do you think that you as like a Gen Zer bring to the kind of misinformation and disinformation world that perhaps older folks, 30-year-old, 40-year-old, whatever, that they don't quite understand, or that like what is the unique perspective that Gen Zers have that older folks might not have?
Ooh, I hadn't thought about this one. I mean, it's growing up with the technology, surely. There has to be some difference there. And just the empathy for understanding why online communities matter so much. Sometimes talking to my parents is just kind of like, oh, well, it's just, people saying things online, right? But if you grow up in a way that, the majority of how you interact with your friends is online, I think it will become important in the coming years to have that empathy of why people believe what they believe and understanding online communities really well. Trying to explain Discord or Twitch to someone who doesn't understand that subculture is going to be very difficult. And a lot of the times, I think that older populations see some of these things as a joke, right? Like the Wall Street bet stuff. It's just like a joke, right? And it's just silly teens doing XYZ, right? But no, this is actually an incredible phenomenon. And you have to, and I think that you would need that kind of dual perspective to understand both the subculture as well as the impacts that it could have on institutions and on the way that we conduct our life day to day right now. So I think that's maybe where I would land on that.
Great. Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's like they've never even been to a subreddit before, so they don't really get
it's a lot of catch-up work.
There's a lot of catch-up work. Okay, well, thank you again for your time today, Isabella, and thank you for the work that you're doing with all of these partnerships and projects. Is there a place that folks you can go to check out viralityproject.org, maybe?
Yeah, viralityproject.org. Check us out.
And where is it possible to find you? Yeah.
Oh, I have a Twitter. I don't remember my handle. Yeah, it's I Garcia-Camargo. Check me out on Twitter. But really follow the Virality Project on Twitter. It's Virality Project, the handle. The team's going to continue doing a lot of great work through August, and then we'll have a big final report. And yeah, always open to chatting, and especially chatting about finding these super, super interesting and exciting spaces that are growing really quickly. I think a lot of people are interested in disinformation and don't really know how they can get into the space and work on these problems. And there's a lot of opportunity right now. So pop into my DMs.
Nice, exactly. Slide to her DMs if you're looking to do misinformation, disinformation. With that, Isabella, thank you again for your time, and goodbye, listeners.